This is a welcome on behalf of Cupar and District and all the 8 organisations which I'll refer to in a minute. The area we now cover is shown as the whole catchment area of Belbaxter High School. It's 17 feeder primaries, plus of course the wonderful Kilmaron. And these talks are an important part of our celebrations of Sir David Lyndsay of Cupar and of Scotland's first play, Ein Satyre, which is the topic of tonight. We're hosted again by Cupar Now, and Cupar Now extends widely over that area. You'll see the feeder villages, which Simon is involved with. And just as a throwaway line, in the 16th century, Cupar's liberty, over which it controlled all trade, is pretty well covered by those all those dots. It was an incredibly wide area, and explains why things like the court were the court of Fife and Kinross. This year's May talks follow on what we started. Oh, I beg your pardon, I've forgotten that bit. Yes, these are the 8 organisations which cooperate in putting these things together, and we have some very good heritage organisations. Cupar Heritage represented here today, Cupar Arts, Fife Family History Society, the Museum in Series, on Fife, the libraries, Falkland, and of course Thrie Estates Cupar. This year's May talks follow on what we started last year. We had 2 last year, and they're up on screen now. So following on with that theme, we have 3 talks this year. We've had 2 already, wonderful talks by Amy Blakeway and Nicola Royan, and today we have the 3rd and final of the 2022 series. As Simon's already said, we're recording and they will form part of the Cupar archive. So I'm now absolutely delighted to welcome Professor Craig Walker to give tonight's talk. His brief CV is in the small print on the screen, and his topic is up very legibly there. So I now invite him to address us on Lyndsays and Satyre, Renaissance Scotland's best kept secret.
Thanks very much, Bill, and thanks, Simon. It's really nice to be here, and thank you for inviting me and for following on from Nicola's excellent talk last week, which I will build on shamelessly and assume you know an awful lot about Lyndsay's court career and his non-dramatic verse, which obviously you do. Now I'm going to try I'm slightly busking while I try and share my screen. Now I've lost what I was. No, there it is. Are you able to see what I can see?
Yes, indeed.
Uselessly, because you can't see what I can see. Right, there we go. I'm calling this talk a satire of the Thrie Estates, Renaissance Scotland's best kept secret, because usually when I talk about the Thrie Estates, people have never heard what it is. Now I'm hoping that because you're here and because you're from Cupar, that's not going to be quite so much of a problem, and I'm going to be preaching, if not to the choir, then probably to the vicar himself. If people are coming from the wider world to find this on YouTube, I'm also guessing you're a sympathetic audience rather than have wandered in. But why am I showing you this? Good question. The website at the bottom, the web address there, is where you can actually still see, thank goodness, after a bit of a scare, the full film of the 2013 production of the Thrie Estates that we put on in Linlithgow, and I was associated with quite a fabulous cast. I'm going to be informed by that production in this talk. So, I mean, I recommend you to go and keep the footfall of that website going, because otherwise Brunel University down in London will probably take it away and it'll be lost to science. But more about that production in a moment. I still think even talking to you guys, it's true that outside of Scotland, and to a certain extent within Scotland too, Lyndsay's satire of the Thrie Estates is little known and rarely, if ever, performed. In Scotland, it's less well known than it should be, I think, and I'll say more about that towards the end if there's time. For despite the fact that it's fairly regularly revived on stage since its rediscovery by Tyrone Guthrie for the Edinburgh Festival of 1948, and there's Tyrone Guthrie when radical young playwrights and directors look more like your bank manager than they tend to do today. The play hasn't actually been performed professionally in its entirety, or wasn't rather, between 1554 and 2013, which is an extraordinary gap, and it must be one of the longest, I suspect, in dramatic history. And I think it's a crime because, as I'm sure you know, and as I'll try and convince you even more, the play is extraordinary. It's extraordinary in terms of its content, its radical political engagement, and it's extraordinary in terms of its theatre craft, of its dramaturgy. It's much more radical politically and dramatically than anything else produced in the 16th century, Shakespeare included. And it actually anticipates dramatic effects and kind of theatrical coup de théâtre that we wouldn't see until the 20th century. And when they appeared in the 20th century in the work of Brecht or of the kind of in-your-face theatre of the 80s and 90s, we thought how revolutionary. But Lyndsay was doing this in the mid-16th century and seemingly without a tradition to build on. So it is an extraordinary piece of work. And I'm going to start with that because I am rather in awe of Lyndsay and his playcraft. There are two versions. I mean, the version that I'm going to talk about today, the longer version, the Cupar version that then went on to Edinburgh, was building on a shorter interlude played before James V at Linlithgow Palace in 1540. And so far as we know, that full version, which Lyndsay then expanded from this short version, was only produced twice in Scotland, in 1552 here in Cupar in Fife, or rather there in Cupar in Fife, and then on the green side here in Edinburgh in 1554. The Edinburgh performance reputedly lasted for 9 hours. And that's plausible, given that there were various breaks and sort of para-theatrical moments, dances presumably, and other musical entertainment. Even the text itself is huge, 4,600 lines long, containing an absolutely wide range of activity. Bawdy scenes, scatological and sexual language of a still frankly striking nature. We got a headline in the Metro when we put the production on saying that the Fbomb was going to be dropped in Linlithgow, and surely it is, because Lyndsay's language is incredibly vernacular and earthy. It contains lengthy political and moral speeches. And it requires a massive outdoor set, which even with the backing of the UK Arts and Humanities Research Council, we couldn't afford to reproduce. And this is the version that we could afford with fairly scaled down special effects on the Peel in Linlithgow. An outdoor set that the script suggests needs areas representing the royal court, which is the thing directly opposite you at 12 o'clock in that circular set. A parliamentary assembly, which we also put there to save space. A pulpit, 3 gibbets to the left on which people will actually be hanged, so they need to be functional. It needed a small river. It needed numerous thrones for its central characters. And in terms of the script, it incorporates a lot of what would be called extra dramatic real world effects. It has not 1 but 2 sermons within it. The first a straight sermon, the second a parodic sermon Joyeux, a kind of comic sermon delivered by the fool in the play, Folly. And it involves the recital of 15, read them and weep, substantial acts of parliament, and no fewer than 3 public hangings, and the timed release of a crow or raven. Now, if you can see the kind of blur in the bottom left of that shot, where the guy with the kind of leopard skin tights is being hanged, that's the only trained raven in the United Kingdom. I guess he's no longer alive, but he was the most troublesome and expensive actor we had, because we had to hire a raven that was willing to be released and then might come back. And he was something like £500 a day for that blooming raven. And he wasn't the most congenial of actors. He took a while to coax him out of his box. I can talk more about raven hiring and raven wrangling in questions, if you like. So given all that massive amount of material, given the eccentricity of what the play actually offers up as drama, a sermon, hangings, the reading of substantial acts of parliament, Understandably, I think modern commercial theatres have been reluctant to kind of devote the resources you'd need to put on a production that ambitious. So they relied upon the version that the writer Robert Kemp produced for Tyrone Guthrie back in the 40s. That in itself was revolutionary, and people still remember the shock and the delight of seeing that production for the Festival Theatre and the various times on which it's been revived. But actually, what our project and our production, I think, suggested was that you get a really impoverished view of the Satyre of the Three Estates, even if you watch the Kemp Guthrie version, because it's only when you watch the whole thing that you really see how politically and dramatically radical it really is. What happens in the play is over that, we did it in 5.5 hours rather than 9. Over that length of time, Lyndsay has the proverbial game of two halves. The first half of the play sets up a conventional morality drama with allegorical characters that comes to a conclusion roughly halfway through the play. Only in the second half to start again and overturn the implications of the first half and do the whole thing much more radically in the second half in a different way. And given that Guthrie cut almost all of the second half because they felt it was undramatic and audiences couldn't stand it, what you actually see in the Guthrie version is the opposite, I would claim, of what Lyndsay actually wanted in terms of the play. I won't tell you about Lyndsay's career because Nicola did that brilliantly last time, but I will just remind you of what she was saying about Lyndsay's preoccupation with political and counsel, counselling the king, counselling the nation, worrying about government, good and bad government. And I'd add to that one of the questions which I think keeps driving Lyndsay through all his work. Why are the poor poor? What is it? What can we do about poverty? Is it something that the state is stuck with forever, or can it actually be redressed? And if so, how? He grew up with James V. He was, as Nicola pointed out, virtually a kind of surrogate father in some ways to James V. So when James died, Lyndsay had a kind of crisis of career and a crisis of kind of purpose, I think. What did a man who was the king's representative in Parliament, Lion Herald, the person who was the interlocutor between the three estates and the king, when there wasn't a king to be an interlocutor to? And part of what happens in the three estates, I think, is Lyndsay imagining how would a state operate without a king? And you're going back to that biblical injunction, woe to the land where a child is king. Well, Scotland in the late 15th and early 16th centuries was very much a land without a king for long periods. And so Lyndsay was troubled by that, I think. And he kind of revisited what he'd given in 1540 as counsel to James V in the Cupar production of 1552 as this massive address to the question, why are the poor poor? What is wrong with Scotland that our kings keep dying and that our government is so corrupt? And he produced the Satyre of Three Estates. And as I say, working with a professional theatre company, working with the director Gregory Thompson, who was for a while the creative director of the Tron Theatre in Glasgow, we discovered, I think probably for the first time, certainly, I've edited the play, so I thought I knew it, but until we actually rehearsed it with actors who said, what am I saying here? What are we doing here? And put it on, I didn't realize how carefully constructed a piece of theatre was. It was. And those things that we all thought, they're impossible to play. A whole sermon, reading out acts of parliament, the audience will leave, they'll boo, they'll fall asleep. In practice, they didn't, because played outdoors over 5.5 hours, what you discover is the play is actually like a concerto. It structures itself with quiet moments and loud moments, bawdy moments and thoughtful moments, so that if you're not enjoying this moment, then something different will come along in 5 minutes' time. And you actually enjoy the fact that for a while you get a sermon or you get something which is overtly political, because there'll be more rude jokes and swearing and shouting and ask if later on. What the play also shows is that Lyndsay clearly understood the conventions of late medieval allegorical drama, even though we don't have surviving plays from Scotland in this period in the way that we do from south of the border in England. Lyndsay clearly knew how those plays worked, in which a central protagonist represents humanity and is persuaded by vices and virtues to behave either wrongly or rightly. And he uses those familiar tropes really skillfully in the first half of the play. But he also enjoys breaking them. You know, he is an avant-garde enfant terrible before his time, because he keeps doing what Brecht thought he'd invented. That notion of a fourth wall, for instance, you know, that a theatre offers you a play world sufficient unto itself. He keeps having characters in the play talk to the audience and even come out of the audience into the play. So he has a tailor and a suitor, a shoemaker, a cobbler, shout in response for two questions from the stage, various answers. And he has a suitor and his wife brought up supposedly on stage from the audience to go through a blasphemous mock divorce. Most importantly, I think, and most strikingly, he has what seems to be a real beggar from the audience called just pauper in the script, circulate among the audience, begging for alms at various points halfway through the play, and then joining the action in the second half. That's the central character in the allegorical part of the play. Rex humanitas, king humanity, both humanity, humankind, and also a king, very much echoing James V, I think, in the course of the way he's described. But before that, I'll do the bit I should have told you before I brought the slide up. Probably most mischievously and most provocatively, Lyndsay starts the play by having the herald figure Diligence, who's in some ways a figure for Lyndsay himself, promise the audience two things. The play will be short, it's 5.5 hours long, even if you run at it, and that no one ever should take offense at it because it's an entirely impersonal critique of abuses. No names will be mentioned in the satirical attacks on the social classes. Prudent people, he says, I pray you all, attack no man grief in special, but we shall speak in general for pastime and for play. I mean, you do see a lot of apologies for the play in the English drama. Someone will come on and say, well, you know, it's not going to be great, but just do make of it what you can. Lyndsay takes that to an absurd degree, because having said, I'm not going to name anyone, the play's vices at the end of the play, as you probably know, when they're confessing to their own sins, actually talk about a huge number of local people in the borders, in Fife and in Cupar in particular. And they name, read them and weep, the Grocers, the Nixons, the Bells, the Robsons, the Hawes, the Piles, the Littles, the Trimbles, the Armstrongs, the Taylors, the Irwins, the Elwins, the Grahams of Ewersdale, the great clan Jameson, the blood royal of Cupar Town, the Andersons, the Pattersons, the Lutmans, the Wellens, the Carruthers, the Douglases, the Cooper Burgess, Tom Williamson, the Taylors, Andrew Fortune and Babberidge, and the Barefoot Deacon, Jamie Ralph, Willie Cadiock, all the brewers of Cupar, and someone called Geordie Silly. So the point that he's making is that everyone present in that Cupar audience, and almost everyone they knew, is responsible for the problems that the play is all about. And I'll say a little bit more about that at the end. But he does it as this wonderful joke. You know, I'm not going to name anyone. And then he names everybody. So you can imagine the audience being really kind of made awkward. It's like kind of alternative comedy almost, when the characters on stage start calling them out. And that's just part of Lyndsay's strategy of completely and constantly confounding your expectations. You know, it starts with this wonderful crafted morality play, as I say, with a central character, Rex Humanitas, surrounded by vices and then purged, only to overturn the whole thing in the second half. So you have Rex Humanitas, the allegorical protagonist, a young, naive king, prone to sexual misdemeanors and to having a good time, as all kings always are, shades of James V, who gradually falls under the spell of a number of vices. First, the kind of innocent courtly vices of youth, placebo, flattery, solace and wantonness. Then sensuality, Dame Sensuality, come fresh from Rome with her ladies and attendants, introduced, King Rex Humanitas is introduced to her by the courtly vices. And then by falling under sensuality's spell, with her attendant ladies, hameliness, sluttishness, and danger, coy teasing, he's introduced to a set of greater vices, falsehood, flattery, and deceit. And they corrupt him utterly and leave him and the realm morally and financially bankrupt. So you have this kind of scene in which the realm is brought down because the prince is brought down. Moral failure in the prince equals economic and financial and moral failure and political failure in the state. Only the arrival of a literal deus ex machina in the form of divine correction, the Archangel Michael, played brilliantly by Tamdine Byrne in our production, with the most expensive angel's wings you could possibly imagine, which were so heavy he couldn't sit down with them. So he appears in the second half of the play wingless. We don't explain it, but it's because he kept falling off the stool when he tried to sit down wearing the wings. Only the arrival of divine correction scatters the vices. That's not actually an authentic 16th century photograph, it's just in black and white for some reason. But there he is scattering the vices and reconciling Rex Humanitas with the Christian virtues, chastity and verity there. Verity, the Bible wielding spokesperson for God's truth, and charity and chastity obviously representing moral continence. So you have this story of a young man growing up, falling into sin, and then discovering the truths of reformed religion. And that story is presented as if it were itself Scotland's story of its fall into political decay and eventual reformation. The fate of the king and the fate of the land are presented as coterminous, intimately related. But having produced what looks like a happy ending with the reconciliation of the prince with the virtues, what does Lyndsay do but say, well, the job's only half done? It's as if he turns to the audience and says, so much for the platitudes of moral drama. What are we actually going to do in Scotland, particularly without an adult prince? And this is where the play gets interesting, because rather than allegory in the second half, you get these figures who represent the estates, the clergy, who are presented very much as at the core of the corruption of the state, and then the three estates themselves, nobility, the merchants, and the burgesses. Where are we? And what they do is not anything allegorical. They political, they politic, they horse trade, they outvote each other in a parliament. What had become in the first half abstract allegory becomes concrete politics in the second half. Self-interest at all levels of society, the failure of good government, a failing clerical class, overtaxation. These become the issues in part two. And I think what Lyndsay's doing is actually inventing a new grammar for theatre here. He's inventing political drama. And he's doing it in a world where the king can't be this kind of magical response. What do we do? Well, we tell the king what to do, and when the king is virtuous, the state will be virtuous too. Lyndsay knew that, knew the state, knew the political world well enough to know you couldn't just do that. So he comes back to this world where the clergy, the nobility, and the merchants have to work out how to make the state purer, better, and actually functional again. And he starts the second half with this wonderful image of the three estates being brought into the playing area, gangen backward, walking backwards, led by their vices. And as John McGavin, a good friend and great scholar of medieval Scotland, says, in a world where processions were a very important part of political and cultural life, that idea of a procession of the Parliament coming in backwards would have looked very, very odd and jarring, I think, in a way that we might find it quite difficult to recapture now. So you have this second half in which at the centre is a corrupt clerical and legal establishment and a state governed by self-interest. And what became clear to us as we were rehearsing the play was that the play actually turns around on the entry of Pauper, of this unnamed poor man. And his entry is really, really interesting. And we tried various ways to make it effective in our contemporary production. In the first half, it's the entry of divine correction that changes everything and makes everything better. In the interval, it's Pauper's entry that changes the tone from allegorical simplicity to political complexity. And he does it in the most interesting way, because one of the actors from the stage, Diligence, tells the audience the play is finishing now. We're going to have a break, go away, eat, drink, and come back for the second half. And even while he's saying that, Pauper starts to circulate among the audience, asking for alms. And the other actors are leaving the stage. So you don't quite know for a moment what this is. Is this part of the play or isn't it? Is this a person coming out of the audience that's going to get in the way of the play? Or is it part of the show itself? Suddenly, I think every member of the audience has to make a decision. What is this and what am I going to do about it? If I'm a burgess, if I'm a citizen, if I'm a neighbour in Cupar, do I try and stop this guy begging from the audience? Or do I just watch it as if I'm a spectator? And so it's this really interesting new aesthetic where you break the fourth wall and you don't know what is going on. Should we give him money even? You know, is he real or is he an actor? Symbolism suddenly becomes very real. And so we dressed Pauper in modern clothes to make it much clearer that he was part of the audience, or supposed to be at least briefly part of the audience, rather than bringing on in kind of Pauper's clothes from the 16th century. Pauper is the first and a very different character to anything we've seen in the play before. He's got real grievances and real needs. He's not just emblematically poor. He doesn't just say, I'm poor. He tells a naturalistic story, full of detail. Where does he come from? A rural area in Lothian, a mile from Tranent, he says. His mother's name is Mould, his wife's name is Meg. The first time we've actually got real people's names mentioned in the play. You know, they're not called poverty and chastity or virtue. They're called Mould and Meg. Mould has died. Pauper's father has died. And Meg has died. And as a consequence, he's lost everything, because every time there's a death, there are mortuary taxes due, paid to his vicar and to his landlord. And so he's lost everything, including his 3 fat cows. And he wants them back. And he's come to Edinburgh, to Cupar, looking for law. He's on his way to Edinburgh, and he wants the legal establishment to give him justice. And he keeps coming back to the fact that he's lost his cows. So the play has this figure who's kind of out with the central narrative, keeps insisting that he wants his cows back. And so I think this makes him a really important figure in the history of British theatre, actually. You know, a member of the working class on stage alongside kings and princes. And Philip Sidney, the great theorist of drama in the 1580s in England, wrote that the thing that's wrong with English theatre is you have princes and paupers on stage at the same time. And 25 years earlier, Lyndsay had literally done that. And if you compare the way Lyndsay treats the poor man in the play with the way the English drama of the same period later treats, you can see just how radical he is. Pauper is really angry. But if you look at the way poor men and poor figures, the common man, is treated in late 16th century English drama, what's striking is they're stupid. They're not taken seriously. They all speak in what the English stage talks about as mummerset. They're these kind of comic accents that they use, rural accents that distract the audience from what they're saying to the way they say it. They make terrible mistakes. They can't understand anything complicated. So this is Nicholas Udall's Res Publica, itself a really serious mid-16th century political play in England. But the character of people is presented comically. Adulation, one of the vices, says, why are you poor? How so? Who hath wrought to you such extremity? People says, nay, tell you so, passeth our captivity. He means capacity. It passeth any man's imagination, says Republica, which people mishears as the name Madge Mason, not imagination. He can't handle difficult words. You say Zooth, it passeth any man's Madge Mason, for we think ye love us as well as any e'er did. So, a comic figure. And when Republica introduces herself, he can't even remember that and calls her rice pudding cake because he can't manage the word Republica. So you have this tradition of presenting the poor in English drama as impotent, foolish, and silly. They have to be rescued by the aristocracy. And this is the classic stage direction from, what is it from? Can't remember. I think it might be Estaitis or something. No, it's Cambyses. Enter Common's cry, the appeal of the common people. Running in, speak this verse, and go out again, hastily, crying. That's it. They're walk-on characters. They play a small part. They're risible and silly. Think of all the kind of comic paupers in Shakespeare's plays. Constable Dull in Love's Labour's Lost. Constable Dogberry in Much Ado About Nothing. Lance in Two Gentlemen of Verona with his ridiculous comic dog. Lancelot Gobbo in The Merchant of Venice. They're all comic figures. They're not drivers of reform. At best, they're pathetic. If they beg someone else more important to do something for them, and if the person doesn't, they're stuck. Lyndsay's pauper is very different. He's not like that. He's not funny. Whereas English drama seems to assume that, as Christ says, the poor are always with you. Lyndsay's drama says, well, why? And can't we do anything about that? It doesn't allow you to laugh at the problem of pauper. And the only kind of equivalent moment when pauper can't understand language, I think we're presented to be on his side. He's talking about the mess he's had trying to get the lawyers to even hear his case and how much money he's had to give to the lawyers. He trusts them, but he's becoming aware that they're not to be trusted. And when you look at this speech, which is really brilliant, the punchline, which is about the incomprehensibility of legal language, is actually with him rather than against him. The joke is on the lawyers, not on him. And I ran to the consistory for plenty, he said. And there I happened among a greedy many. They gave me first a thing they call sitandum. Within 8 days, I got but libelandum. Within a month, I got ad opinandum. In half a year, I got interloquendum. And then I got, how you call it, ad replicandum. I can never in word yet understand them. Boom. That we're laughing with him, not at him there, I think. He doesn't misspeak. His accent is real. He speaks exactly the same Scots as the king and the council. He doesn't know his place. He keeps protesting. Although he's reduced to begging, he wants justice, really, not just a handout. It's those cows he wants back. And he doesn't mind speaking up and speaking roughly to the important people on the stage. He's not deferential. When Diligence says, get off stage, man, you're going to spoil our play. He says angrily, but not unreasonably, I will not give for all your play a sow's fart, but there is little play at my hungry heart. And suddenly he's bringing in a whole set of values that the play has to take account of. When Diligence tells him, don't worry about clerical taxation and the law. That's always been that way. It's consuetude, tradition, long practice. And what he says to that is, and consuetude against the Commonweal should be na law, I think, by Sweet St. Giles. And he says, were I a king, I would change all this. And that's really a kind of very powerful warning of a pauper on stage saying, what would I do if I were a king? In the course of the play, he's supported by a character that, if you were here for Nicholas' talk last week, you'll know well from the lyric poetry, from the narrative poetry. John the Commonweal, the emblematic figure of Scotland, who is, like Pauper, poor, ragged. He's wearing a ragged garment, symbolic of the fact that the state has been run ragged by the lawyers and the clergy and the nobility. And he gives some extraordinary speeches. I mean, I'll just give you one because time is running short. But speeches that still now speak to us, I think, in an age of fat cat bankers and old Etonian corrupt governors, I'm allowed to say that, then these speeches still have power. They don't seem quaint and old. Here's John the Commonweal explaining why the rich get away with crime when the poor can't. And here he is shouting at the government. Again, a poor man, emblematic of the state, telling the government what it needs to do. Get off your asses and put this right, he says. So here's that speech. Integral thief that steals in cow, a petty thief who will take a single cow, is hang it. But he that steals in bow, a whole herd of cattle, with as mickle gear as he may terrace, that thief is hang it by the purse. See, Pickham, peddle thieves are hang it, but he that all the world has rang it. Here we go. In cruel tyrant, in strang transgressor, in public and common public plain oppressor, by birds, by bribes, may he obtain favours of treasurers and compositors. Though he serve great punition, gets easy composition, and through laws consistorial, prolixed, corrupt, and partial, the common people are put sa under, though they be poor, it is no wonder. I mean, you wouldn't think that was written in the deferential culture of the mid-16th century. If Shakespeare had written that, every school child in the country would learn it by heart, I think. But here's Lyndsay telling us a truth about injustice and the power of wealth to avoid justice that is still striking and still redolent today. So what you get in that second half is a real shift from kind of comfortable allegory and courtly drama to something much more dangerous and much more political. And at the end of the play, when the Parliament has finally, under the power and the direction of divine correction, come up with a set of laws that reform the clergy and reform the legal system, and the sheer detail with which Lyndsay imagines putting things right in the play is astonishing. He doesn't just wave a fairy godmother's wand and say, and everything was fine in the country. He's got plans for a second legal college to go into the Highlands to bring justice. He's got taxation. He knows what he wants to close the nunneries to do. They'll fund education. It's a real program of political reform. And if there's time in questions, I can say a bit more of that, because I think it's exactly the program of political reform that Archbishop Hamilton is trying to introduce through the church court and through convocation and through Parliament in the real world at the same time. I don't think Lyndsay is a firebrand Knoxian Protestant. He's a reforming Catholic, and he's got a serious agenda to produce. Even after all of that, Cupar doesn't say, yes, sir, thank you, sir, I'm very grateful, and go home. He hasn't got his cows yet. So he's still furious and still angry. And he's kind of still on stage there telling the audience that this is not a done deal. We need to sort this out. And he says, you've all done very well with all these acts of Parliament, but it's not enough. And he says, I will not for a pair of clacks 2 fourpenny coins. Ye had not made these noble acts. I pray to God and sweet St. Gill to give you grace to use them well. Were they well kept, I understand, it were great honour to Scotland. But then he says, it had been as good as ye had slept it. It would be as good as if you were sleeping, as to make acts and be not keep it. So making an act of Parliament is one thing, delivering it is the other. And the play ends with this really kind of poised moment in which some reforms have been enacted, but they're not enough. Flattery escapes. Flattery does a deal, so he gets to hang the other vices and survive. And the last person to speak on stage is Folly, the fool, who comes on. Oh, there's good counsel, which we made Gerda Stevenson a woman because there are so few parts for women. Here's Folly, the fool, who gets a very long speech in which he says that actually the world is still full of fools. Folly is everywhere, and you can't expect to solve the problems of the play until folly itself is removed. So it points back to the vices on those gibbets, saying, you know, we're all to blame for this. So the play ends not with an answer, but with a question. And the question is, you know, what are we going to do about the play? Not what are the actors going to do? What are the imaginary creatures on stage going to do? So what happens in, and this is the last paragraph, you'll be relieved to hear, what the play does, I think, in winding up, is reinforce the fact that it is a play of two halves. The second half is much more difficult, much less self-contained and theatrical. You know, if this is a political theatre, a piece of political theatre, then part one is the theatre, part two is the politics. There are no bawdy interludes in part two, no songs. The humour where it appears is biting and it's satirical. So when Guthrie and every director since 1948 cuts part two to give us part one in a kind of polished form, what it does is it bowdlerizes the play, it eviscerates it, it takes the whole thing and turns it into a version of the comforting version of part one. When Lyndsay went part one purely to set up part two and to show how inadequate allegory is as a way of actually solving real world problems. And Pauper is at the heart of that, bringing that new tone of realism that shakes the dramatic frame halfway through. Here's an uneducated working man sharing the stage with princes and their advisors, being taken seriously on his own terms. So I think if the play is going to be played, and I realize you're going to do a modern version at some point, but if the whole authentic 15th, 16th century version is to be played, it deserves to be played in its entirety, because that's where it's striking and where it's strident. That's why it shows why Scottish Renaissance drama was so far ahead of its English equivalent at the time. The sheer audacity of what Lyndsay does in the play is only there in the whole thing. So why isn't there a Lyndsay Festival Theatre in the same way that there is a Shakespeare Festival Theatre? Why isn't Lyndsay at the heart of images of Scottish culture? I think because England never recognised it. That's the problem. You know, we live in a dramatic culture which from the 17th, 18th century was really driven by London. And London doesn't get Lyndsay because he's 9.5 hours long, because he speaks in a middle Scots, older Scots. And there's no kind of equivalent in England of the public political drama that Lyndsay is offering us a model of. So the Satyre of the Three Estates remains a one-off. And it remains, I think, what I've called it in the title for this lecture, Scotland's best kept dramatic secret. It's the best drama in Europe that Europe has never heard of, I think. Thanks very much.
Greg, thank you very much for an absolutely superb talk. It's hugely educational because, as I've said to you in private and before the event started, we're all enthusiastic about Lyndsay and the play here, but we don't know as much about him as we ought to. And you've certainly gone a long way to helping that. Thank you. Also, terribly timely, isn't it? I think it was Rory Bremner who said that modern politics had done him out of a job because you couldn't satirize what was actually going on. And yesterday and today show how Lyndsay's caring would be so relevant. Yesterday's scandals, today attempts to help the poor at a time when we really are in a dreadful state. And Lyndsay would have understood that. And in fact, that's really part of what he's addressing, if I've understood you correctly.
Absolutely.
I wonder if I could ask the first question. It's no surprise that he attacks the church. It's no particular surprise that he attacks the nobility. Why particularly the burgesses and the merchants? Well, never mind the lawyers, we'll leave them out, shall we? but the the special pleading there, as they say. But was it, for example, because they controlled so much of the commerce and the trade? Because one of the things we showed you on the introductory slides was the area of Cooper's medieval liberty, where the burgesses of Cooper had so much control. So, I mean, is it that what are the real sins of the burgesses, leave aside the lawyers, and the merchants that he's attacking?
I mean, again, it is really detailed, and it's impressive in its detail. I mean, anyone who knows Chaucer and Langland and those kind of satires will recognize some of it. But the sheer detail of, the trades and their associated abuses. And his point, I think, is that by having the trades represented in the three estates in Parliament, there's no way to oversee them. They're looking after themselves. They're writing their own, they're legislating for themselves. So short measure, adulterating the wine, selling people things that are past their sell-by date, not having the skill to do the thing that they claim to be doing. All these things are produced with real color and local detail in the plays. They are criminal, but there's no one to police them because they're policing themselves. And that's the same with the clergy. He makes a nice analogy, which other people have done, which is, that a tradesman needs to be expert in his trade. So you wouldn't go to a shoemaker who didn't know how to make shoes, who didn't know how to measure your foot and your heels and produce a shoe that would fit you, albeit they try and skimp on the leather and they'll still overprice you and they'll say it's Spanish when it isn't. But you accept a clergyman, a pastor, who can't read the Bible, who's not learned enough to understand Latin, who isn't eloquent enough to give a good sermon. So the sins become, one complex omnishambles, to use a modern word, where everything reinforces itself. And because you can't get beyond this caste that's self-interested, you can't reform them. And the idea that it's a divine angel who comes down, I think is both realistic. The only thing that can remind us is plague or the visitation of God's wrath, because that's what jolts people into making decisions. And brilliantly, at the end, they have a debate in Parliament, and the clergy, spirituality, and his attendant clergy says, I'm just not going to vote for this. You can say what you like, we're not voting for it. And merchant and nobility turn to him and say, you're one vote and we're two. And that's what brings reform, because divine correction and the king have so scared nobility and the merchants that they're willing to go along with the reform program. It's real pragmatic stuff, I think.
It is. It's a manifesto, isn't it?
Hmm.
Thank you for that. Open for questions, please. Let me hog them.
I'd like to, it's not really a question, it's just picking up on the final thing you said there, Greg, and why isn't there a Lyndsay theatre or whatever? This is a long time ago now, but we did some work with folk in Stratford, and it always sort of amused me that Stratford is this complete magnet, and yet 1879 I think it was that the first Shakespeare theatre was built more than 200 or about 250 years after the guy died, and it was a brewer that brought it back to life, Flowers Brewery, I think, a local businessman, who said, well, we must have a theatre. Well, if it's 250 years after Shakespeare died that Stratford got its act together, perhaps it doesn't really matter how many years after the death of Lyndsay that Cupar and Fife can get its act together and start the plan to do something here. It was just an observation, really, having been involved in a small way in things going on in Stratford. Nothing happened for more than 2.5 centuries after Shakespeare popped his clogs, until a businessman said, well, wouldn't it be a good idea to make something of this?
I mean, it does take time and will. I mean, they campaigned for that theatre for a long while, and when they got the money, they could do it. And it's the same with Shakespeare's Globe. It took Wanamaker to say, and to keep saying it, while people said, no, I can't do it, crying noise, can't do it, stupid, no. And he kept, well, I want to do it. And he kept, and then they built it. And I think there's a lesson there. You know, if a lot of people in the local community have the willpower to persevere, you know, you can build something in, I'm sounding like, what's his name, in the Field of Dreams, aren't I? If you build it, they will come. I mean, I think why would you go to Stratford? You know, it's got an association with Shakespeare's name, but, you know, most of his work was done in London, but they made Stratford the site of Shakespeare pilgrimage.
Yeah, I mean, they eke it out extremely well in Stratford because there's so little remaining of anything that was relevant to Shakespeare at all. But they've made it a great success. But yeah, I'm with you. I think there's a huge opportunity there, and I very much enjoyed the talk. So thank you very much.
I mean, and there's a deal you can do with Linlithgow. You know, they've got the surviving palace ruin, so there's a Lindsay trail at very least to be done.
Yes, indeed.
Edinburgh, Cupar, Linlithgow, and various other sites that Nicola was talking about to some extent, and which you've talked about, Bill. You know,
Ian,
I can see a Lindsay trail.
Yes, Ian has a question.
Yeah, thank you. It's an observation and a question. I'm of the generation who was taught Shakespeare, Chaucer during English studies at school, and I never heard of Lindsay really till I came to Cupar. Has anything been attempted to get some study of Lindsay on the school curriculum, or has it been attempted and found to be too difficult?
I don't know as much as this I should know. I mean, there are periodic attempts to put him and excerpts from the play and the poetry into various parts of the new curriculum. When we did our project, we did schools visits, and, you know, we tried to evangelize for Lindsay. But it is difficult when, you know, curricula are now so centrally driven. You know, you have to work for a long while and get a minister who's willing to buy into it. And, you know, there's no way that in England that will ever happen for Lindsay, because, you know, Scotland doesn't count. But it's plausible to have it here. I mean, the great thing was when we did the production is, you know, the culture secretary came and various other people came, and we had an event in Holyrood, and a number of other MSPs turned up, and they all remember affectionately reading bits of Lindsay at various points, and they remembered productions they'd seen. So I think it would do a lot of interesting work if it were part of a concerted effort to be put on the curriculum.
Thanks to our celebration weekend last September, including quite a bit of Old Scots, I may have mentioned to you before, Greg, that the primary schools here in Cupar have now adopted Old Scots and kicked off the Romans and the Egyptians. That, of course, is project work, and it's not the same thing as studying language and trying to understand a play. But my hope is that if they've learnt that in primary, if they've done the projects in primary 7, then it wouldn't be quite so earth-shattering to invite them to read something once they move up to the high school. And while Baxter at the moment has a slight problem with that, without a full head, having had a slightly untidy change. So we haven't actually dared push anything at them yet, but that's certainly one of the thin ends of the wedge that I hoped might come from the initiatives that Cupar took last year. And we have magnificent support from the primary school heads for this. But of course, as you rightly say, it's very centralized, and they can't control curriculum for excellence, if that's the word.
Yeah, I mean, I think very briefly, I mean, part of the problem is the written Old Scots. If you show people a page of Lindsay's Three Estates with its Cohilca and all that kind of thing, they think, I don't know what this is. When people came to the production and heard it spoken, they knew what it was. You know, it was so much closer to the vernacular. And, you know, people would say afterwards, my granny spoke like that. You know, that word I haven't heard since Uncle whatever. You know, hearing it is a very different experience to reading it. Reading it, it does look like a foreign language. Hearing it, it sounds like, you know, the tones and often the words that we know. Sorry, Nicola, your hand is politely up. What have I said that's wrong?
Nothing. You said that nothing is wrong. I think firstly I was going to advocate for Rhiannon Purdy's current project, which is reading older Scots. And if you look, search, Google that, you will find a website where they are starting to put together materials for delivering older Scots in schools. Precisely that is to start thinking about hearing it, or what are the tricks. There are some tricks there. This spelling in 16th century Scotland is remarkably standard in many ways. So once you have the tricks, you get your eye, and it's not as hard as it looks, but it is terrifying when you first encounter it. I think there's a really interesting question about curriculum and about what's said for examinations. I was hunting around, I now can't remember why, in the SQA for the national awards and the higher national awards. And amongst the acceptable authors was Herrick, Robert Herrick, but no Alexander Montgomery. Really? So there are kind of extraordinary things, and part of that is actually down to universities, where Scottish material and all Scottish material is not taught at universities. So what we have is a lot of English teachers who are themselves scared of it, because there's not an expectation. There's increasingly no longer an expectation to read anything before 1800. So they themselves are scared, and it's absolutely terrifying being in the classroom when you don't feel confident in the material. And you have to deliver it to a group of skeptical children, skeptical adolescents, and persuade them that they want to do it. And there aren't editions. There isn't the funding for cheap paperback editions. I mean, Rod's Satyre, Canongate Satyre is brilliant, but I don't know how cheap it is and whether it's accessible.
I've got 15 copies behind me I bought for £1 each from a remaindered shop, but I think that's bad news rather than good.
Rod will be thrilled.
Nicola, that's very helpful, and it's also very important that we understand the realities of these things, because if academe isn't on side, then obviously it's not going to develop. It was a big breakthrough on Burns Night this year, no, last year, wasn't it, when Rona Alcon and the Scots Language Resource Network put their online Scots dictionary for schools and launched that. I have no idea what the uptake has been, but I took that as a great encouragement to the sorts of things we've been discussing. Is there a final question? Because I think we've just about hit 7 o'clock, and I like to keep these things to time if we can. Ian, please.
Just for information, for Greg's interest, prior to the Linlithgow production, we had a group of strolling players arrived at Cupar Museum by rail one Sunday morning to do some publicity shots around Cupar, namely on the Castle Hill and so on. And they made great play. They arrived in full costume and were very amusing as they gave their versions of what was about to be produced. Unfortunately, one of the guys fell asleep and didn't wake up until Lookers, so everything was delayed till he turned up, but such is life.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's very nice that people thought to come to Cupar for that. Excellent. Well, I think if you don't mind, I'm going to bring this excellent evening to a close. Greg, that was absolutely superb. I knew it would be. And you've done exactly what we wanted to do, because as I've explained before, we had Amy looking at one aspect of Lyndsay, more the person, more the active politician. Nicola last week was telling us about his works other than the play, and you've now put the cap on this process, if you like, the progress, and it's been superbly done. And it's really brought it home, I'm sure, to us, using those photographs of what an actual production looks like, because obviously we've no idea what it looked like in 1552. Just as an aside, one of the projects that's been going on here, which was very serendipitous, was the special collections of the St Andrews University Library, cataloguing the entire archive of the Royal Borough of Cupar from 1346 to 1975. And I can't wait to get my hands on the records of the 8th of June, 1552, after the pubs were told the previous day to open at 10 in the morning and stay open all day. I bet there was a fair amount of legal retribution to be distributed on the 8th of June. But that's purely a aside. Greg, thank you so much. And not only for tonight, but for the encouragement that you've given us in the build-up. It's been really superb and much appreciated. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And a final thank you, as always, Simon. Thank you, and Cupar now, for what you do and for hosting us. So I think we'll close. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your evenings.
Thanks.